What's up, everyone? So everyone always wants to talk about privacy and anonymity, but no one really talks about the massive spectrum that's in between. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Autonomy is the starting point of the privacy spectrum. That's where we'll begin. So it's the equivalent of basically standing on a stage with a spotlight directly on you with no mask, just total all-out exposure. Autonomy isn't bad in every scenario. It's required in virtually all legal systems that I'm aware of and things like professional environments. You want to think about it kind of like signing a contract or putting your name on a loan. There's a lot of checks vis-a-vis identity before you even get to that point. It's basically a public commitment, and you need people to know you're actually accountable in those kind of situations. So there's absolute power in that level of exposure, but it's like power wrapped in a neon colored target, right? It says basically, here I am, please go ahead and scrutinize every single move I make. It's really great for things like LinkedIn profiles where your name and credentials are basically currencies of trust that you're putting out there, but that full exposure absolutely comes with some obvious risks. Things like harassment, doxing, and identity theft are a few things that you can name right off the bat. Imagine giving your home address to everyone who likes a post that you made. You might not actually want to do that, but that's the level of risk that autonomy can actually carry if you aren't actually careful. Now, the practical workaround is to use it only when trust is more valuable than privacy. And even then, you definitely want to think about actually blending in some level of protection or disconnect from that, if possible. Now, our next step would be anonymity, which is the next step in this more moderate form of visibility, where you have a little bit less exposure. This word, if you're curious, actually came about in the 1890s. You're recognizable, but not totally out there. You're out there, but now you're not totally out there. You're not totally laid bare, right? Like, think of it like your work self, basically. The version of you that's basically shared in things like email signatures and on business cards, right? People see your name, your position, and maybe a bit of what you do, but they didn't actually see the personal data behind the professional facade that you actually have. This is useful because it keeps the interaction professional. They can contact you, work with you, trust you in that professional space, but they're not really totally about to find out what's actually in your Netflix queue or dig into that weirdo blog that you wrote 10 years ago about the ferret training that you did, or in my case, a neophyte's guide to the underground on Pakistan security. The issue here, though, is that anonymity can still be linked back to personal info if someone really determined has enough breadcrumbs, we'll say. This is where tools like Google removal requests absolutely come in handy. Keeping your public name separate from your private life is fairly important to a good amount of people. Another suggestion that I would make is on Experian, you have the option to automate this process of your information being out there and having it automatically taken down for a monthly fee that they absolutely take their time in actually putting out there, but they do automate it to some extent, which is pretty awesome. Now, partial anonymity is where things get a little bit more ambiguous. You're given enough to be known, maybe just a first name or a recognizable avatar, but not quite enough for people to actually dig too deep. It's kind of like being on a first name basis with a group of casual acquaintances at a community event. They can call you by name and they can recognize you when they actually see you, but that's about it. The anonymity in this case is not complete, but it's enough to protect most of your personal space. However, there's a downside to this. When more trust is needed, like in serious collaborations or contracts, anonymity doesn't hold up. You're forced to give up more information if you actually want to proceed. The smart move here is to transition to pseudonymity if things start to get too close to comfort, while still keeping your distance. Now, synonymity is about identity. through the lens of a group, if you will. Syn in Greek means together, and anonyma means name. Synonymity is blending in with the choir or the group. Mainly, it centers around things like collective identity. You're an admin, you're a support team member, or just basically one of the voices in a shared group account. If you've ever been on 4chan, anonymous is basically that. Historically, this kind of anonymity was used to reduce personal accountability, like monks signing letters as brother or as a group rather than as individuals, which kept the focus on the collective efforts rather than personal credit. The earliest known use of this word dates back to the 16th century. It's perfect for a variety of different environments, but specifically ones where the message actually matters more than who's saying it, like in customer support or in moderation roles. But if you're trying to actually build personal branding or get credit for things like specific actions, synonymity just kind of blurs you into the mess. If you want to actually break out, you might shift to pseudonymity, keeping privacy but getting a distinct identity. Pseudonymity is basically the bread and butter of the internet, right? Pseudos means false in Greek. This is just basically using a fake name. I think it's something that every one of us has done, and that still has, to some degree, real reputation, right? It's like being Batman or being Hugbunter. People don't actually know your real name, but your mask still carries, to some degree, a lot of weight. And we see this a lot with darknet vendors or famous hackers or even hacking groups. It was polarized in the 19th century, but dates back even further than that. So think of pen names in journalism or pseudonyms or pseudonymous online accounts that have basically gained respect. Your identity stays hidden, but there's still basically a personality that's there that people can recognize and know, right? Pseudonymity gives you freedom. You get to speak without tying your real identity to your words, which is great for things like free expression. But there's always that risk, that one misstep, one connection with your actual IP address, and basically suddenly your pseudonym is tied to your actual identity. And this is the exact problem that we see when you see massive OPSEC mistakes by either darknet vendors or darknet market admins. Some practical steps to actually avoid that include things like never actually linking your pseudonym to your actual real-life identifiers like phone number, email, right? Treat it like an entirely separate entity altogether. This should be done in a way that completely and utterly isolates each other. So, for example, if you're using Tails for XYZ profile while only using ABC for Linux Mint install that you have, you basically never cross-contaminate or cross those identities on either operating system. You keep them wholly and completely separate, kind of like you do with salt and pepper. Now, Polyonymy takes the concept of privacy a step further, embracing a multifaceted nature of human identity. This is having many names, many identities, each existing in its own compartment. Poly means many in Greek. Basically, it's like you're a YouTuber here, a small business owner there, maybe a completely different persona on Reddit. The goal of Polyonymy is to prevent cross-contamination altogether. If someone knows you as a darknet buyer, then they shouldn't easily be able to connect you to, say, your darknet vendor account, right? This level of segmentation keeps your various roles distinct and completely separate. So what's the drawback? Well, it's kind of exhausting, right? I mean, to manage all of these different versions of yourself and know which one's which, right? Think of just the mental load alone that it's actually going to take to remember which email, which persona, which set of details belong to which situation, which slang, right? Like even down to linguistics, this comes into play. A password manager is kind of essential here, as well as other tools to be able to try to remember all these things and keep them cataloged in an organized way, but also in a secure way. Cryptonymity gets a little bit more clandestine. Cryptos in Greek means hidden, And this is the domain of spies, blockchain enthusiasts, basically anyone who needs really serious privacy. Your identity is encrypted, concealed, but still theoretically discoverable. It's common in things like espionage, military operations, and cryptography. It's essentially kind of like having a code name that's wrapped in another layer of encryption. It's there, but it'll take a lot of work to actually decrypt it. Now, think of like the blockchain wallets or spy code names, right? If someone actually really wanted to, they could trace it and figure it out, but it's kind of difficult enough that it keeps the casual snoops at bay and away. Now, to enhance this, adding layers like VPNs or just overlay networks like Tor when you do communicate and do stuff absolutely helps. The idea is to basically make yourself the least interesting target in the room. Like, why break the hardest lock when there are easier ones that you can easily bypass? Now, to give you a kind of a working example of when these are actually employed, governments and organizations use cryptonyms to protect things like classified operations and keep them fairly organized. A great example would be Operation Overload in World War II, or Operation Paperclip, or even MKUltra. Ephemeral Identities is one of the easiest to actually understand, but it also has its own kind of complexity. Ephemeral comes from the Greek word ephemeros, meaning lasting only one day. Now, this is the idea of a short-term, disposable identity. You're here, then you're not. It's the burner phone of the identity world, basically. Do you need to try to set up a quick account to buy something off Amazon and not have a long history chain of everything that you bought? This is where a temporary email address would come into play. Want to talk to someone without giving them any kind of personal information? Create a chat room with OnionShare. These are some examples of ephemeral identities which minimize traceability, because the idea is to make the identity vanish when it's no longer actually needed. The downside is a lack of continuity. If you ever need to actually return to the same people or contact, you've got nothing to actually fall back on. Ephemeral identities are best for short-term needs where you don't actually intend on building any kind of rapport or lasting relationship or credibility with that particular individual. It basically enhances privacy by minimizing the digital footprint and your overall attack surface, or rememberability, I guess we'd say. Now, after all of that, we finally get to God mode, right? We get to anonymity, which is the purest form of privacy, and also the most challenging to actually maintain in today's world. It comes from the Greek word an, which means without. And the last part means name, so without name. Anonymity is when you're completely and utterly disconnected from your identity. It's the Tails OS, it's a cash transaction, it's the anonymous forums where no one actually knows who you are. Anonymity offers the highest level of privacy, and I would argue security, but comes with a lot of inherent problems. Things like lack of trust, lack of reputation, and often things like unwanted attention from authorities who assume that anonymity equals wrongdoing. And it's an important tool, especially for those who are actually facing things like oppressive regimes or wanting to protect their privacy at all costs. But it requires rock-solid OPSEC to actually be able to maintain. All it takes to screw up your anonymity is one slip-up or one moment of forgetting to route through the right network, and your anonymity is lost. So, I mean, this spectrum is fairly massive, and I wanted to cover it in detail for a long time now, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions in the community about what anonymity is compared to the whole rest of that spectrum. A lot of us don't actually operate anonymously, even if we're on the darknet with another identity or another name. It's not necessarily purely an anonymous identity. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a few things. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.